Hello and a warm welcome to this Headlines Today special broadcast, Votonomics. This is a first of its kind survey, assessment, analysis, study ever done in India which looks at whether there is a positive correlation between economic parameters and voting patterns. The India Today group has commissioned Professor Surjit Bhalla to conduct this study for us. He's looked at data from 1980 and I've got a panel with me to help decode the numbers that Professor Surjit Bhalla will be putting out just now. Dr. Arvind Varmani, one of India's best-known economists, is with us in the studio. Also, Rohit Saran, editor-at-large, India Today. Sadanand Dhume joins us for an international perspective. Also with us on this program to give us the perspective from the two main political parties. Piyush Goyal from the BJP is with us in our Ahmedabad studios, and we've got Salman Soz joining us to represent the Congress. I want Professor Bhalla to first come with me to that big monitor so we can explain to our viewers what exactly is it that Professor Surjit Bhalla is trying to do. Because this is the first time ever that we're looking at whether there is a positive correlation between economic parameters and voting patterns. And you've looked at elections since 1980, and you're essentially trying to see if the work that a state government does will determine how people go out and vote.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And you know, this is first of all a caveat. This is a fun exercise, but that's not to say it is not important, it's not relevant. And what we are trying to do is only look at economic factors, not caste, not any other variables that do affect elections. This is just to see how much of election results can we explain by looking at things like
just
prosperity.
Give me a moment. Votonomics actually tracks four things. You're looking at rural wages, you're looking at inflation, you're looking at the rate of growth of the GDP in that state. Yes, so the question is there now a pro-incumbency factor that operates across caste and religion lines? Is development the biggest factor determining voting fortunes? And if economic development were driving votes, what would the current assembly election results look like? You've seen the exit polls, you've seen the opinion polls. If Votonomics were to determine election forecasts and election vote numbers, is there a correlation between what the other pollsters have said and what Votonomics is saying?
And basically what we are saying is not only there is a correlation, but there is a causation. That people vote according to their pocketbook, which is often talked about. People vote if they are feeling better about themselves, about their prosperity, about the economic development that has taken place, and do they vote against those people who do not perform. Notice over the last 10 years it's become very important on your TV channels, everybody else, that really outcomes matter, performance matters. That's why people are getting re-elected, beating anti-incumbency. 10 years ago we only talked about anti-incumbency. Now it is performance, and we are reducing performance to economic performance because that's what the voter really feels.
Okay, let's do this one state at a time, and I'll start with Madhya Pradesh first. We look at the data for Madhya Pradesh. You've had a fair chance to understand how this model operates. We'll break it down even further. If economic parameters were to determine voting fortunes, what would happen? Professor Surjit Bhalla's model projects that Shivraj Singh Chauhan's BJP would actually increase its vote tally by 1.1%, whereas the Congress being led by Jyotiraditya Scindia in this election would see its tally dip by 1%, coming down from 32.4 to 31.4%. And how is it that Professor Bhalla arrives at these numbers? Now, this just looks a little complicated to the lay viewer who's not an economist, but if you can explain why growth, inflation, rural wages and poverty are the four parameters you've chosen to try and find a correlation with voting patterns.
Okay. And it is first, just to point out, and it says quite clearly, it is the acceleration in growth. It is a change in growth. How much better are you? The trend is for you over the last 3 years prior to the previous 3 years. So all of these numbers are acceleration, either a deceleration or an acceleration. So the assumption is if there is an acceleration in growth and you are incumbent, people will vote for you. If there is an acceleration in growth and somebody else is incumbent, they'll vote for them. And obviously the reverse, if I perform badly in terms of growth, people will vote against me.
So let me just try and explain that to our viewers. Professor Bhalla is looking at growth over the last 3 years to see if growth in the last 3 years in comparison with 3 years before that has actually gone up. So that's the 0.3, which means that in Madhya Pradesh, the fortunes of people 3 years ago were worse than they are now. There's been a positive
just
bump.
slight correction. Let's say I'm growing at 6%. Now I grow at 6.3%. So there has been an acceleration. So it's not that previously they were not growing.
But they're growing faster.
They are growing faster.
What does inflation at 0.8 mean? Does that mean that inflation is going up or going down?
Prices
so
going
you're
down.
saying that in Madhya Pradesh over the last 3 years, in comparison with 3 years before that, prices have actually come down.
The rate of inflation has come down. Prices are going up, we know that. It's like taxes. Prices
It's not going up as fast as it was 3 years before.
Always keep remembering that this is change. Whether prices are going up as fast as before. Look, if prices going up 5% every year, then it doesn't really matter, right? I am used to it, 5%. So I look at change always as a voter, and that is what the economic performance is.
Okay, then is rural wages, because this is important. Otherwise, how do we know whether it's the industrialists who are making all the money?
Exactly.
Which shows that the state GDP is actually growing up, but the poor man's not benefiting. So Surjit Bhalla is looking at rural wages, where there's been a
acceleration. So therefore, in Madhya Pradesh, on average, the last 3 years, wages have gone up at 4 percentage points faster per year than the previous 3 years.
And poverty is actually coming down.
It's been
which basically means economically,
in a higher rate.
Shivraj Singh Chauhan has done a good job.
Very good
And
job.
what does that reflect when it comes to vote percentages? If you can just look up, sir, at our camera over there, we'll now put out what Surjit Bhalla believes the new assembly of Madhya Pradesh can look like. So he's saying that the BJP will end up with 149 seats. That's a gain of 6. He says that the Congress will come down from 71 to 65. That's a loss of 6 seats. This is what Surjit Bhalla is saying. How does this compare with the poll of polls? You've seen the India Today ORG poll. You've seen C-Voter. You've seen Chanakya. You've seen different polls. We've averaged those out for our viewers. The poll of poll numbers are BJP at 140, the Congress at 77. You're giving the BJP 9 extra seats, the Congress 65. So you're giving them less
Congress
seats.
12, less seats.
Than what the other polls are projecting. I want to now bring our other panelists into this discussion. We'll come back with the next state of Rajasthan. But I first want to get Rohit Saran to explain the thinking at the India Today group behind doing this sort of a study and coming out with these numbers. Because so far, thought has been that caste, identity, religion, all of this also plays a very important role. It's not divorced from just pure economics.
Absolutely not. So we do not discount that they matter, but we are pretty sure intuitively that economic factors have begun to matter more than ever before. The caste matters, region matters, religion matters, but so does economic. Just two things. The share of private sector jobs in the last 10 years alone in the overall economy has grown phenomenally, and a private sector job is far more dependent on the state of the economy than a government job. The size of the economy has grown by 4 to 5 times. Say if my income was, if all of country's income was 500 billion, it's now $2 trillion. So that's, so it's like...
No, but the basic premise is
that economy
that if
matters
people
more
are
than
doing well, they
Yes.
will vote the government back.
Yes.
And you're also saying that economics now is more important than caste and religion.
Yes, no.
Yes.
So suppose if there were 10 factors that matter earlier in deciding how Rahul and Rohit voted, of which economy accounted for only 2, we are saying it now accounts for more than 2, maybe 4 out of 10 instead of 2 out of 10.
In a country like the United States, where you say, Sadanand, this might be true if Obama isn't doing well economically, if jobs aren't growing fast enough. All opinion polls show that his situation is precarious. In India, there have been several instances, most notably, say, Lalu in the 90s, when they won, regardless of how the economy is done. Are you skeptical about such a study?
There's a Jewish proverb which says, from your lips to God's ear. So when I look at Surjit's study, I say, I hope he's right. But the fact is, I'm a little bit skeptical.
Why is that?
I'm not sure that we have evidence from enough evidence from recent Indian elections to say that this is a uniform trend. Maybe there is something happening at the margins. I'm not convinced that this is and maybe I will be convinced during the course of this program, but I'm not convinced at the outset that this is a trend that we can be certain is happening.
There are lots of outliers as well, Professor Surjit Bhalla. Is this an empirically established trend?
Okay. First of all, look, there is, if the analysis gets all the things right, that is all the 4 states right, then I think the credibility goes up. But that's not to say that this is the only thing that matters. Now let me tell you, Rajasthan is a
We'll come to Rajasthan separately. Let's just deal with Madhya Pradesh right now.
okay, in Madhya Pradesh, for example, in 2003, the economic model would have suggested that Digvijay Singh would have won handsomely, and he lost very handsomely. So indeed, even when the outliers are there, the economic model did not work in Madhya Pradesh in 2003. Okay, it's worked very well in 2008. I think it'll work very well in 2013. So even that has information that people, despite having good economic growth, other factors came in. It wasn't caste, it was personality. I don't know what it was.
Arvind
but
Varmani,
the point is, yes.
Economists like Surjit Bhalla would love that this model worked, because that just then puts pressure on state governments to deliver economically.
Right.
But is that really what Indian elections are about?
So
now?
let me give you a slightly different perspective. You know, social factors and caste factors change very slowly. You know, once in a while you have a revolution. VP Singh, you know, he introduced certain things which could have disrupted everything. But what this depends on is that those things are slow to change. In normal times, it's a growth. Now, for 30 years from the start of independence, you had very little changes in growth. So you are seeing more effect. I don't think it's the fact that people never worried about growth.
Okay.
It's that now you're seeing faster changes in growth. So that would be my perspective. And what is good about Sujit's study is he does very detailed, extensive econometric work, which is vital for distinguishing
it is not our case
factors.
at the India Today group to suggest that this is a perfect study or that we've cracked a model which will beat all exit polls and opinion polls. However, this is a step in that direction to see whether economic parameters determine voting patterns. And on that note, I want to introduce the two political guests that we have. Salman shows, from what we've seen of Madhya Pradesh, the figures, the economics seem to suggest that the Congress doesn't have much of a chance. Jyotiraditya Scindia campaigned all across Madhya Pradesh. His rallies got a fair amount of response, but Professor Surjit Bhalla believes that because Shivraj Singh Chauhan delivered so much economic growth and prosperity to Madhya Pradesh relative to how things were in the state earlier, the Congress doesn't stand much of a chance.
Well, you know, first let me congratulate Headlines Today and Dr. Bhalla for kind of breaking a new ground in India on something which we intuitively think is going to happen over time. I've studied development very closely. I think it is only a matter of time when development takes more of a kind of center stage in Indian politics. So that is very good. I think this attempt in some ways kind of heralds that kind of beginning. But of course, this is a beginning, so this is still a simple model. As you'll see, there's a composite of four kind of indicators that has been taken. And you know, if you look at these indicators, you have, say, for example, you take rural wages. Now you have 4 states that are being kind of looked at, but if you look at Delhi, rural population accounts for a
We'll
very
come to Delhi
small,
separately. I don't want to get too
proportion.
ahead right now. We'll do it state by state, and we'll
Okay.
look at each of the states separately.
No.
I want quick comments also from Piyush Goyal before we
Let me
put out
just
the
answer
figures
that
for
one.
Rajasthan.
I think
Piyush
I think my
Goyal,
broad-
you know, in India, how acceptable is this data? We've seen data collection being poor in certain states. We've seen charges against certain chief ministers that they are pushing up their numbers. There's a lot of study in China about how the numbers are bogus. So can there be any reliability of such a study which looks at numbers put together by external people?
I'll of course like to join Salman Bhai, my friend, that Rahul, you and your team have really brought in a new paradigm in Indian political discourse. And I think it's a very welcome step, particularly when my leader, Mr. Narendra Modi, has been talking very much about development and progress and trying to bring the economic narrative back in center stage. Very clearly, Surjit ji has brought in 4 parameters. My gut is that the poverty reduction figure does not seem to fit into the whole narrative, possibly because that's a very small segment of society that is impacted by that poverty reduction figure. Probably a larger part of society is affected by growth, by inflation, by real rural wages.
No, but poverty is
So I would
important
say that
because we want to know,
amongst the poor-
Piyush, whether the poorest of the poor, who are also
very
the biggest voters, are actually seeing an improvement in their condition. We don't want rich industrialists to be
Absolutely.
making all the money and it not going down, because then there would be no correlation.
But let me-
Surjit Bhalla wants to make a quick point to what
just a
he's heard
very
both
quick
Piyush
point.
and Salman
They-
say. Yes.
One is that the poverty numbers now are about 22%, so it is a small fraction, and he's right. But there is an important point that both Mr. Soz and Piyush has raised on rural wages. Let me just explain that the Delhi rural wages are taken from Haryana for the very simple reason we don't have much of a rural sector here. However, what that is capturing, the wages go together. So it is very, very unlikely that rural wages accelerate and urban wages decelerate. So it's taken as a proxy for the
So you're
entire
saying if
state.
rural wages are going up, urban wages are likely to go up automatically?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the change in them is also like, they
We
might
will
be
chat
lower.
about this further.
Yeah.
I want to put out figures for Rajasthan so the viewers keep seeing the figures and we can keep breaking them down. Professor Bhalla,
Yeah.
if you can accompany me to the screen, please, and let's just put out now the figures for Rajasthan. And we'll take, you've understood broadly how the model works, we hope. We'll now take a look at what the vote projections for Rajasthan will be if Votonomics were to determine how people actually go out and cast their mandate. Professor Surjit Bhalla predicts that Vasundhara Raje's vote share and the BJP's vote share will actually go up by 2.4%. That's because the incumbent Ashok Gehlot is seeing the Congress's vote share come down from 36.8 to 34.4. That's a loss of 2.4% of the vote. Why is this happening? How does Surjit Bhalla arrive at these vote percentages? Remember, there were 4 factors he believes are very important. If we can put that graphic up on our screen right now. Under Ashok Gehlot, growth is coming down, inflation is also coming down, rural wages actually coming down instead of going up, and poverty is coming down. So why don't you explain these numbers, sir?
One, again, it is deceleration. Not rural wages haven't come down, but the rate of change of rural wages has come down. And I think the first number is very, very important. That's per capita GDP growth. And GDP growth in Rajasthan has really fallen. The other interesting bit, and we'll know on Sunday, about the Rajasthan projection is that basically Mr. Gehlot has really pushed the one scheme after another, Yojana one after another, and if you will, Votonomics. So this might be a test of, not the only test, of Votonomics versus growth. The Congress under Mr. Gehlot has really pushed Dole, and the growth rate has faltered, and we'll find out what the voters go for.
Okay, and you're also saying that poverty, in comparison with how it was 3 years ago, is
It's
actually
falling
better
faster.
off. So it's
falling faster.
Poverty
But
figures
remember,
are coming
on
down.
poverty, it is 20, 25%, 30%. So it's not as if the entire, but yes, absolutely the case, the poverty has fallen faster.
I want to then take a look at what the new assembly in Rajasthan would look like if these numbers were to determine how people actually went out and voted. So if this Votonomics model holds, Vasundhara Raje and the BJP would end up at 97 seats. That's a gain of 19. The Congress would end up at 77. That's a loss of 17. Now this is lesser than what opinion and exit polls are reflecting, and we'll have Surjit Bhalla explain that, because the average of all the polls suggest, and if our camera person can zoom this in please, that the BJP would end up at 115, the Congress at 65. So the Congress is 12 less than what you're projecting, and the BJP is
about
100 it's about 17 seats more than what you're projecting. Why is that, sir?
Well, we don't know. We'll find out on Sunday, and
No,
then
why
we'll
are you
look at
saying
it.
this?
No. Basically, it is a combination of these variables. As you saw, the poverty was declining at a faster pace. So some people are feeling much better off, and inflation has also fallen. So it's a net effect. And really, I think what the India Today Oxus model should be tested with is a reality. Not necessarily this. We'll find out who's more
But there's
correct.
a median of error as well.
And there's
a margin of error.
There's a
But I
margin of error in this, just like it is in opinion polls, just like in exit polls.
But your margin of error is bigger than the margin of error in
I don't think so,
exit polls
but
and
we'll find
opinion
out
polls.
on-
Okay,
on Sunday.
I want to go across to Salman Soz, because whether it's 97 or more than 100, the fact is Ashok Gehlot failed to deliver growth to Rajasthan in the way that people would have expected and wanted, and that then is a missed opportunity. His reliance was so much on Votonomics, as Surjit Bhalla says, that he failed to push growth, and that's why people in Rajasthan are as angry as they are with the Congress government.
Rahul, I want to go back to Dr. Balla's earlier point, the initial point that he made, that this was a fun exercise. This is a fun exercise because it's a very simple model, including four indicators. In fact, I would, Sadanand Dume would actually bear me out if, there's a very great statistician, young man called Nate Silver in the US, who does phenomenal modeling with lots and lots of indicators. So having 4 indicators. By the way, let me just tell you that in poverty, Rajasthan's poverty rate is below 20%. Chhattisgarh's poverty rate is close to 40%. Of course, by it's harder to bring down 20% poverty as opposed to 40% poverty. So obviously you'll see different kind of effects of that. So I don't think this is as much about whether or not Mr. Gehlot delivered. I think you will see when the results come out that there'll be lots of differences. I think the way we should look at this particular exercise is that it's a beginning. It's a simple beginning. It's fun. It's a fun exercise, as Dr. Balla said. But beyond that, I don't think we should ascribe too much to this thing.
Sadan, why don't you explain to our viewers the Nate Silver model, why it works so wonderfully well in the United States, why he's considered a genius, and why such a steady, or the initial steps to arrive at the complexity of his model is actually a very important exercise.
I mean, without getting into sort of nitty-gritty, because I'm not a pollster, I mean, the basic thing is that the US has a great deal of sophistication and predictability in these models by now, because they've been tried and tested against reality over and over. But I want to make 2 quick points about Rajasthan over here. The first is, stepping away from the poll, in economic terms, this is the most important of the 4 states because it is a referendum on what you call Votonomics. So if Gehlot wins after this spate of freebies, that's a validation of what I think is an economically harmful model. So that's the first part. The second thing is that, we are contrasting these polls with the polls of polls. But in fact, what we should be looking at is where do they reinforce the poll of polls? So in Madhya Pradesh, you saw it's reinforcing what we're seeing from everywhere else. So I'd very confidently say that, Surjit is probably right. But on Rajasthan, there's a very interesting divergence where the prediction from this model is that the BJP gets far fewer seats than it would otherwise. And if I had to bet, I would bet on the traditional polling rather than this.
Yeah. 2 points on that. One is, as far as the economic model is concerned, only the economic model, Rajasthan is a graveyard. People have, amongst the pollsters, Tamil Nadu is a graveyard. You can't really. So the economic model just is not able to get Rajasthan right at a reasonable
historically.
So I think that's what's going on.
Okay.
I had to choose. My bias is the same as that, but I'm trying to be truthful over here. This is what the model predicts, but I'm saying that the errors for Rajasthan are the largest. Second, and a very quick point on Nate Silver, who is a person who I completely admire, it's his entire analysis based on opinion polls. So he hasn't done an economic analysis. The person who's done the economic analysis since 1970 is Professor Ray Fair, and he started this whole, if you will, literature on economics. So Nate Silver, accurate as he's been, he just took the various opinion polls that were there and made his best judgment, econometric
So there's
judgment.
a big difference.
Yeah.
Their opinion polls usually get it right, unlike our pollsters who
And
just
he has a
now,
lot.
hours before counting beginning, actually still
let's not
confused
blame
about
our
Delhi.
pollsters.
Yeah.
Let's not blame our pollsters. In the US, there's practically a survey every day leading up to the election. And so processing that is relatively easy for a statistician. And that's what Nate Silver did. Absolutely brilliant job. Absolutely. And he's also a baseball statistician, something I have in common with him.
Yes.
Not baseball,
Everybody
but
knows
cricket.
that from Hollywood.
Cricket
Yes,
in my case.
Let me bring in, I have some doubts about the inflation variable, and this is a good time. I think one of the factors why this difference is coming could be inflation, because historically, I have seen that in every single survey, inflation used to be the number one priority, but it never mattered historically. So it would be new to me. Frankly, I'm not still quite sure about the inflation variable because it would be completely new as far as my analysis.
He's absolutely right.
Ashok Gehlot is hoping, Piyush Goyal, that none of this matters, that all the doles that he's rolled out will matter to people much more than economic growth, and that will see him through. So there's a completely counter strategy that the Congress and Ashok Gehlot are banking on as far as Rajasthan is concerned.
Well, Surjit ji rightly mentioned, in a way, Rajasthan will be a test case for Votonomics. But I think the important point that comes out of the Rajasthan figures is that we'll ultimately have to have a matrix where we calibrate the effect of these economic numbers and bring in substantial issues like leadership, issues of corruption, issues of the sentiment in the state. Sometimes the sentiment tends to build up over a period, over the campaign period. There is also one very important variable which you may like to consider, is whether there was a direct contest or whether there were too many options. So were there too many dissidents? Were there small parties in the fray, like Kirorimal Meena, the Meena factor in the elections, 3-cornered, 4-cornered contest. So I think it's 4 or 5 more variables are joined to these 3 or 4 economic variables. We could very easily draw up a matrix which may not necessarily be uniform across the nation, but could largely be seen in terms of the southern states, the Hindi heartland, the eastern states, and possibly the west.
The number of players is very important, because if it's a bipolar contest, it's different from there being 3 players, from there being a quadrangular contest. So the reality of Indian elections is very, very complicated and very difficult to put into a uniform model that can be implemented across the country. Rohit.
Yeah, right. 2 things. One, this model, as Dr. Lecha, is largely assumes bipolar contest. Which, if you say,
but in Delhi,
which is what has been the case in the 4 states.
Yes,
except Delhi, which is now a triangular contest.
And one small thing on Rajasthan, since Saran rightly said, but one thing which we haven't rightly displayed on this screen is that what this model predicts is a range of 16 plus minus. So when you showed 97 for BJP, you actually, if you want to see the final result and compare, one would compare with plus minus 97 minus 16 or plus 19 to see whether we fell within the range of this forecast or not.
Now what I want to do is move to Chhattisgarh, and we'll take you through the numbers for Chhattisgarh, and then we've got Delhi, which is very, very complex, because there's a new googly, a new player out in Delhi, making life very, very difficult for economists and pollsters alike. Let's look at the numbers for Chhattisgarh, please. If economic parameters were to determine voting patterns, Surjit Bhalla predicts that Raman Singh's voting percentage will go up by a whopping 4.8%, whereas the Congress's voting percentage will come down by 4.7%. What is it that is leading into these numbers? If we can take a look at that, please. This is the coefficient on the 4 economic parameters that Surjit Bhalla has worked out, and all of them clearly show that Raman Singh's government has done a good job when it comes to these parameters.
Actually, amongst the 4 states, on all the variables, Raman Singh has done phenomenally well. And if you will, it's rather interesting that in Madhya Pradesh there was a growth acceleration of 0.3, but in Chhattisgarh there's a growth acceleration of 1.1. Indeed, when we come to the other 2, and Rajasthan, there was a growth deceleration. So actually, Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh are interesting test cases of the economic model. The opinion polls and everybody else is saying that this is too close to call, perhaps because of the Maoist influence or whatever it is, and Rajasthan is an easy win. I am predicting just the opposite. We are both predicting that that the BJP will win in Rajasthan and the BJP will win in Chhattisgarh.
So the coefficient on all the 4 parameters, poverty, rural wages, inflation, and
phenomenal,
say that Raman Singh's done a great job.
Yeah, absolutely great job, and that's why the voting percentage, and that's why the number of seats that I give, or the economic model gives more accurately to Raman Singh, is higher than any opinion.
Let's take a look at what the seat projections are actually like. If economics were to determine voting percentages and that were to translate into seats, what is Surjit Bhalla predicting for Chhattisgarh? Let's take you through those figures now, because you're actually predicting that the BJP will end up at 60 seats. That's a gain of 10 seats. The Congress would end up at 28. That's a loss of 10 seats. Now remember, let's take the poll of polls now, because the poll of polls is actually showing a very different result. Some polls are saying it's too close to call, but net the poll of polls says the BJP at 51, the Congress at 36. You're giving them 9 more seats, the Congress 8 less seats. So that basically is on the back of the work done by Raman Singh.
Yes, and it is economic performance, easily measured, objectively measured. There is no, if you will, denying the fact that economic growth, poverty reduction, wages, inflation decline, everything has come in together for Raman Singh.
This is completely
the best job amongst these 4 states.
This is completely counter to the Congress claims in Chhattisgarh, because the Congress wants people to believe, Salman Soz, that Raman Singh hasn't done a good job. But when looked at from all the key parameters that Surjit Bhalla has identified, the Congress campaign has been flawed, which is why it hasn't cut much ice with the people of Chhattisgarh, Salman.
I'm sorry. I really keep going back to this whole idea that this is a fun exercise. If you look at the 4 parameters that we have, you cannot really compare Chhattisgarh with Delhi, for example. I mean, Delhi's economic base is huge. I mean, per capita income is huge. So in order for Delhi to grow faster than Chhattisgarh, I mean, it's obviously harder. Delhi's poverty rate is 9.9%, whereas Chhattisgarh's poverty rate is 40%. So it's easy to come down from 40 to say 35, as opposed to say from.
That's an important point you raised. That's a valid point. It's an important point. Surjit Bhalla must answer that.
I think that is why.
Yeah, let me just answer.
This is a very simple model. This is not something that you'll see that this is not a very sophisticated model. Obviously, it's a good step. It's a good beginning. But you won't. I mean, the economic.
Okay, you raised that question. Let Surjit Bhalla respond.
Very quickly. Look. It may be a fun exercise, but it's also an involved exercise.
And I don't know how he's having fun. The Congress is being routed in each of the states, and Salman
but the fact remains that, look, it's the change. So therefore, if Delhi goes from 13% poverty to 10% poverty, it's really almost the same as somebody else going, if you look at the percentage decline, from 30% to 22%. So therefore, I wouldn't put too much ice on this place as low poverty. That's a separate argument. Do levels matter? Do levels of poverty matter? And the point, very simple argument on that they do not matter, because that's already incorporated into the system. That's already incorporated into the voting. So therefore, people have voted whichever government had brought down poverty. So please remember, at least from my side, the real important factor here is the change, not the level.
Okay. Piyush Goyal, what these figures also show is that just one moment, Salman. What these figures also show is that Raman Singh has done a very commendable job in Chhattisgarh. In the national narrative, Chhattisgarh comes into the headlines usually only when there is a terror attack. But in comparison with how things were 3 years ago, in the last 3 years, the quality of life, their income, their wages, the state GDP is actually much better. And this has been a less reported story and hasn't really been in the mainstream consciousness.
Rahul, it's a small state, and over the years it was always looked like a Bimaru state, a backward state. So obviously it didn't come in the limelight. But it's very widely recognized, not only in India, but also by the World Bank, also by the own Central Government Planning Commission, that Chhattisgarh, in terms of good governance, they brought in e-governance in their PDS distribution model. They were actually able to involve the panchayats in the food program, food security program. So, in a way, good governance matters, and the fact that the Congress did not have a leader that they could project. So I think
but one second, I want to put this question to Rohit Saran. This is an important point that is being raised by Salman. Naturally, in a state that is more developed than an undeveloped or poorly developed state, it's easier to push some of these numbers up, even in terms of the change that you can bring.
Yeah, but that has absolutely no effect on voting pattern. What Salman is saying is factually correct, but for this analysis, it's completely irrelevant. Because if I'm living in Delhi, I'm not going to judge Sheila Dikshit's performance based on whether she inherited a better state than Chhattisgarh. Absolutely not. So, and the same can be said for Bihar for the last 60 years, right? So, this is never as a factor for a voter.
But Arvind Virmani, that's also where possibly the limitation of the system is questioned, because it's not looking at Naxalism, it's not looking at sentiment, it's not looking at whether there's a sympathy wave for the Congress because so many of their senior leader dies. It's only looking at economics. So some of those economic performance meters will actually get tempered by the reality on the ground.
Definitely, that's true. When I first started working on this in 2004, people, pollsters used to compare Bihar with exactly what you said, Delhi and other states. Yeah. And that's the one big change I actually made in my analysis, to say, no, they are looking at their conditions and how they were before. So I am fully on board with Surjit on that particular point. Now, as far as other factors are concerned, yes, if I remember my earlier forecast, I was wrong on Gujarat. And it turned out there were special factors in 2004. So yes, special factors like what happened in Chhattisgarh, the Naxal assassination, the murders, can affect. And we don't know how they will affect. And we'll find out. If he's over-predicted, could be that that factor was important.
And one of the other key factors, Sadanand, is the presence of rebel candidates in the fray. If the Congress and the BJP both have big rebel candidates in different states, they could be taking away some of the votes which completely don't get factored into a model which only assumes that there are two players.
I think that's a really good point. And I think that what you're seeing out of these, in these states, particularly the last one and this one, is that the economic model is diverging in very interesting ways from what the polls of polls is telling us. And so this is it's almost a measure of what those other questions are, right? So things like the intangibles, charismatic leader. If we end up with numbers that are significantly different from this, maybe that's a way where we're looking at those intangibles.
No, but I have a counter to that, Sadanand, which is that broadly they're directionally the same. It isn't as if directionally they're different. The quantum of seats might change a little, but they're pointing in the same direction.
Sure, but the quantum can be quite different in two of the states.
And also you're comparing an average with an independent.
There's a lot of information in it being different. And so when the results come out, and if it is the case that Chhattisgarh gets much lower seats, Raman Singh gets than I'm predicting, then it is these other factors that have been said. I'm the last person on the planet to say other things do not matter. I'm just saying it is important to study, increasingly important to study the role of economic factors.
But this much is established that economics is playing a role in determining vote percentages. Other factors also matter, but other factors are not paramount. The paramount factor, it seems today, is economics, and other factors are then weighing in on the side. We've looked so far at states where there's been a bipolar contest between the Congress and the BJP. Then, of course, there's the mystery of Delhi, which is confounding all those who are standing outside polling booths as well and still don't know whether it's the BJP, the Aam Aadmi Party or the Congress that's going to win and what sort of vote and seat percentages they could end up. So brave man Surjit Bhalla, let's go back to that big screen and let's look at the figures now for Delhi. Because before you put this out, I want you to spend a moment, Surjit, explaining to our viewers how Delhi, look towards the camera please, how Delhi is different from others, because the Jhadu, the broom, was 0% last time. So how do you suddenly incorporate a new party, and that also as unpredictable a party as Arvind Kejriwal?
And this is a very important question. This is what pollsters have faced in terms of Delhi, and this is what economic analysts have faced. There is no prior history to the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi. So how did I approach this problem? So first, absolutely correct, we do not have data for it. But the point is, if you don't have data, you don't invent data, but you try and look for similarities. So I looked at those states that had three-party contests in the last 30 years and tried to see what effect the third party had on the resident two parties, and from there derived the results for this case.
But AAP is a unique phenomenon. How does it compare with, say, an NTR or an AGP or any of the other parties? Because the circumstances are unique to that particular state.
Absolutely, and that is why maybe that the forecast is that the Aam Aadmi Party won't do as well as NGR.
Okay, so let's take a look then at how Sheila Dikshit's government has performed on these key parameters. And just to remind our viewers and those who've tuned in late, this 1.3 coefficient actually indicates that in comparison with 3 years ago, over the last 3 years before voting happened, the growth rate is actually down in comparison with how things were earlier. Inflation
is much better.
You're saying is better.
Yeah,
now, this is
is
counterintuitive. How is inflation better than 3 years ago?
Because people
look at the price of tomato, onions, all of.
People forget that 2008, 9 and 10 were the bumper years in terms of inflation. We've seen the very recent inflation. I'm taking averages over 3 years, and actually statistically and otherwise, the average of the last 3 years is lower than the peak period of Indian inflation last 65 years, 2008 to 2010.
So you're saying don't get carried away by what you're paying for onions and tomatoes right now?
No, you do get carried away, and as Arvind pointed out, that every survey that India Today has done and anybody has done, inflation always comes up as number one, but it's never worked.
But broad
this
strokes,
time I think it's going to work.
But broad strokes, the reality is that unlike say Chhattisgarh or Madhya Pradesh, where most of these were ticks, over here Sheila Dikshit has two big crosses. So she hasn't been able to grow Delhi in the last 3 years faster than the previous 3 years. Let's take a look at what the seat projections would look like. Now Surjit Bhalla is going to project if economic parameters were to determine voting percentages, what could the new assembly look like? You're predicting just 35 seats for Raman Singh, for Harshvardhan. That's just 12 more than they got last time, just about hitting the majority figure. Sheila Dikshit coming down from 43 to 21, and you're saying that Arvind Kejriwal will end up at 11. Since this is a new entrant, explain these figures to us, please. And before that, let's just compare this with the poll of polls. So people will then get a sense of how your numbers are different from the poll of polls. Okay, so the BJP, the poll of polls says will end up with 33. You're saying 35. The Congress, the poll of polls say will end up at 22. You're broadly in line with 21. The Aam Aadmi Party, again, you're broadly in line. 13 says the poll of polls. You're saying 11. So explain how you arrived at these figures.
So as I said, I looked at all state elections over the last 30 years that had more than two parties contesting, looked at what the relationship was in terms of the change in the vote share. And remember, Congress is a constant in all of these. What is the change in the vote share of the Congress in a two-party system versus a three-party system? And then, so that's the number one. You're looking at a restricted sample, you're looking at less observations, but you're looking at those that are particular to the situation. And then you look at the economic factors. Basically, Delhi has done badly in terms of the economic factors. The whole country has done badly, but Delhi, if you will, compared to, and here's the interesting result, as it happens, and untouched by human hands, as they say, and this is the data everybody can observe, the CSO data, that the two states, the two BJP states, Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, have shown an acceleration in growth rates. The two Congress states, Rajasthan and Delhi, have shown a deceleration. Now, before Mr. Soos comes in and says Delhi cannot be compared, Rajasthan can certainly be compared with Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh.
Salman, so this is your cue. The trend that seems to be emerging from these figures is that BJP chief ministers are doing a better job than your candidates. That's not good news at all for the Congress. Salman.
Well, the way Dr. Balla has constructed these indices, what it tells you is that he's trying to fit this kind of his preconceived what model he has in his mind, and he's kind of trying to fit that into these four states. You just cannot actually compare. I think it would have been better had Dr. Balla taken, say, for example, Delhi, and taken rural wages out of that and used a different indicator. Kind of customizing the index.
That would be the Salman Soos model of vote projection. You can offer one to
I think that is what you would have to do, because this model is actually not correct.
But that's an important question.
It's just a good beginning. It's a good beginning.
But that's an important point, Surjit Balla.
There's a very quick answer.
There's a lot of work ahead.
As I said before, the rural wages are not Delhi wages because there isn't a rural area, they're from Haryana, and therefore another method is to take out wages exactly as you're suggesting from the model, and you get exactly the same result.
Also take out poverty. Poverty also you have to take out because like you said, if the government has already been rewarded for poverty reduction, and it is not relevant anymore, then you take it out and get some other indicator. That's how you can construct a good index.
Yeah, so you're a bit ahead of me, but you're absolutely on the right track. So basically, the first two variables that I looked at, the core variables, are the inflation and growth. And the point is, for Delhi, as well as the others, you get broadly the same results. Obviously not the same exact result, but you get the same pattern. The addition of these two variables does not make any material difference to the results. But it's growth and inflation.
Piyush Goyal, life for Surjit Balla is far more complicated because of the presence of a big broom in the frame, and because Arvind Kejriwal also possibly threatens to throw Surjit Balla's model out of Delhi, because that again is the other fear, because it will completely upset conventional political thinking. Piyush.
I think, Rahul, it's as Salman also says, it's a brave exercise, but we should not shoot the messenger. I think thanks to
the messenger has got helmets and bulletproof jackets.
I'm not shooting the messenger.
No, I think
I welcome this exercise actually.
Yeah, go on, Piyush.
Yeah. I appreciate Salman bhai. I think it's a great effort, and I think thanks to this effort, we may actually see politicians becoming more responsive to the demand of the times, may actually start behaving more economically correct, rather than always allowing politics to prevail over economics. And I think if we as responsible leaders, both from the media, from the economists, think tanks, and from politicians, could start recognizing the importance of a better life for the people of the nation, I think we would actually be doing service for the nation.
But that's very
Service for
important.
the people.
And Rohit Saran,
So
this could
let us-
force
let
someone
us
like a
take
Rahul
this-
Gandhi
Yes.
to reassess his approach to politics, because it's all about welfare economics, about doles, about the poorest of the poor, what the state can do for them. Whereas, you know, how industry feels, investor sentiment, where the capitalists are running away with their money, hasn't been so important for the Congress party so far in the last few years.
Yes, so that's a big difference between UPA 1 and UPA 2, as they say. That UPA 1 was about high growth and low dole, and UPA 2 is about low growth and high dole. So after this next elections, you're right, Rahul Gandhi will be tested. And I think what this exercise would do, and we will do more as Headlines Today and India Today follow, Sabha, is to see the people have, just like they vote with their heart, they also have begun to vote with the wallet. And this is what is going to do. You know, what is my income growth in the last years? You know, it's people. We believe people subconsciously already vote with that in mind, but now they will do consciously also.
Yeah, Sadan.
Two quick points. The first is that I think in many ways this is the Delhi one is the one that is the most
Trickiest.
significant, because this is a place with educated voters that we know has a history of elections decided by economic factors. The famous 1998 onion election. But I have a question about your inflation measure. And this is something, you know, building on what Rahul said when you were up near the screen. When a real person thinks about voting on inflation, it's like how much, like in the US you talk about how much does petrol cost at the pump. It's something that pinches you that day or that week, as opposed to what you've constructed, which is average of 3 years versus 3 years. How does that work with real people?
I think, look, it is a valid point. And again, the future exercise will say, I'll only look at inflation last year. Second exercise is I will only look at food inflation. These data at this disaggregate level for each state is rather difficult to get. What you can get, which the Planning Commission does collect in order to by each state, urban, rural, is what the inflation level is in order to determine the poverty line. So clearly, you know, and with the GDP growth, you can say industrial growth, you can say job growth, etc. So what they hope is, and the expectation is, that these variables broadly capture what's happening with inflation, what's
Also,
broadly capture
2009
what's happening.
elections were won by UPA at a very high rate of inflation. UPA 2 came to power at independent India's one of the highest rates of inflation.
But the one message also before we conclude, Arvind Varmani, is to all those who get elected, your first task should be to deliver growth and prosperity and development for your people.
Right. In that line, you know, in my hypothesis is that this inflation is actually capturing what I call public goods, or you call bijli, pani, sadak, that people are really, it's a proxy for governance and corruption. So that is my hypothesis, but it needs to be tested further.
Well, this is just the first step in this direction to actually work out a votonomics model. In any case, broadly and directionally, you've seen there seems to be a growing correlation, much more than the 80s and the 90s, between how a chief minister has performed and whether or not people want him back. Salman Soz, Piyush Goyal for joining us on this broadcast. Yes, Piyush wants to make a quick final point. Go on, sir.
Just a very small point you may like to consider in any future exercise. This will also tell the people of the nation that when the vote gets split between three parties, the third plays a spoil sport, something like a vote cutter. And very often what the voters really want to reflect as an outcome gets adversely affected because of the vote cutter.
Yes.
So such
The
exercises
BJP would
will
like that
actually
message to go out. I don't think Naveen Patnaik, Mamta Banerjee, Mulayam and Mayawati would agree. But nonetheless, you've had your piece. Salman, we're out of time.
Rahul,
So you
one
have
final
15
point
seconds.
from me too.
Yes, 15 seconds, Salman.
Rahul, one final point. Just, very, very quickly, I think we could also add social indicators, social development indicators to this mix, because just looking at purely economic variables is probably going to kind of not give you a good picture. So if you want to have a composite index, like what the UNDP does in terms of the Human Development Index, I think that actually might give you a better picture, because remember NDA in 2004 had good rates, growth, low inflation, and they lost.
That's a point well taken.
Very quickly, infant mortality rates is already on the cards in order to test how infant mortality rates have changed. So absolutely right.
We'll keep working on this model with Surjit Bala to try and look at various other parameters and introduce them into the equation as well. But clearly this is an important discussion to put out in the public domain for each of us to think. Television can't only be about noise and fury, it's also about getting people to think about the issues that are determining how people go out and vote. Thank you very much for joining us on this special broadcast. Rohit Saran, Surjit Balla, thank you very much for making the effort of putting this together for us. I can promise you there will be more editions of Votonomics on Headlines today as we build up to the big election of 2014. Thank you very much for tuning in tonight. News and updates continue on the other side. We're back in a moment. Thank you very much.